We have come to what I believe is the hardest day in the entire Christian calendar year. Today's Good Friday, and it's when we recognize the last day of Jesus' earthly life. The events that took place on this day thousands of years ago were the culmination of and fusion of numerous factors: political, social, economic, spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, fear, hatred, hunger for wealth and power, compassion, mercy, love, human and divine. And I'll be honest, this is the message every year I dread the most, because what do I say? Most of us are familiar with what took place in Jerusalem thousands of years ago. Jesus was crucified, nailed to a cross in an extremely brutal and inhumane way. He was made to be a public spectacle on display for the whole city to see, that if you go against the Roman Empire, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, if you step out of line, this is what will happen to you. The cross was the Roman Empire sign of their oppressive regime. And back then, everybody knew what it meant. Adhere to the laws, pay the excessive taxes without complaining, don't stir up trouble, and know who is in charge. Now, today is a tough day in our faith journey, because if you're like me, you want to skip over this day and get to Easter. We modern day people have both an advantage and a disadvantage of the spoiler alert. We know what's going to happen in the story. We know that Good Friday is just a stopping place, not a staying place. But for those who were there in person, they didn't know this. They were dealing with a cold and cruel reality of death. Their friend, teacher, brother, and son, who they loved very much, is going to be executed today. He's going to die, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so hopefully God will step in and prevent this tragedy from happening. And I'd like for us to pause for a moment here and let that sink in, because we modern day people also have the benefit of 2020 hindsight. Again, we know what's going to happen in the story. But because we are so far removed from the context, from the time and place of these events, we have no problem with Jesus' divinity. Most of us understand that Jesus was God in the flesh, that God moved into our neighborhood with us and spent time up close and personal with us. But because we're so far away from the context, the time and place of the events, we modern people have trouble understanding Jesus' humanity. And oftentimes we only see Jesus as divine, and we forget that he was completely human as well. In Jesus' day, the opposite was true, because people could see and touch Jesus, and they had no trouble with his humanity. He was a real flesh and blood, living and breathing human being. And because of their experiences with the human Jesus, they had trouble understanding Jesus' divinity. And so for them, the events that took place on that Good Friday so long ago weren't so good. They were dealing with the most difficult situation we humans deal with: death. And so today, on this Good Friday, April 10th, 2020, I want us to think about Jesus, the human, not Jesus, the divine Son of God. And for us humans who have to deal with the aftermath of death, when we are left behind after someone we love dies, this is the time in our journeys we wish we could skip over and not experience it. Or we wish we could rewind time so that our loved one was still with us. Death does have a real sting that we feel, and we have to deal with the aftermath of death. And for we humans who have to deal with the aftermath of death on this Good Friday, in the midst of death's sting, there really is hope. Not wishful thinking, but real hope. Because in the midst of death's sting, God gives us sign of his presence, of hope and promise, of resurrection and transformation and new life. But we have to pay attention. And if we're not careful, we can miss the signs of God's presence in our lives. I'm recording this message near a dogwood tree in front of the parsonage because this is one of God's signs to us in the midst of death's sting, of the hope and promise of resurrection and transformation and new life. Legend has it that in Jesus' day, the dogwood tree was the biggest, strongest, and straightest tree. Its wood was perfect for building because of its strength and straightness. And because of this, this was the tree of choice used by the Roman Empire to make crosses. And it's believed that Jesus was crucified on a cross made from a dogwood tree. And because of this, the legend says that the dogwood tree grieved. Its heart was broken over being used to kill Jesus, the human. And in response, the dogwood tree drooped in sadness. It changed its physical nature to where it now is not a big and strong tree. It grows quite crooked instead of straight. Its branches now, instead of being thick and hardy, are narrow and bent, not good at all for building. In addition, the dogwood reminds us of the hope and promise of Easter through its blooms. Did you ever notice that dogwood trees have a knack for blooming just days before Easter, like now? And it doesn't matter that Easter Day doesn't happen on the same day every year. You know, sometimes Easter's really early, sometimes Easter is later. But whenever Easter is, the dogwood's blooms open just in time for Easter morning. And have you ever looked at the blooms? They're made of 4 petals, taking the shape of a cross. In the center, there is a cluster that resembles Jesus' crown of thorns. On the petals' edges, there are indentations that look like nail holes. And on the edges, notice the coloring that reminds us of Jesus' blood during the crucifixion. That's the legend of the dogwood tree, a tree that grows in abundance here in the South. It truly is a sign of God's presence with us, and that in the midst of death's sting, God's grace, love, mercy, and hope abounds. As we continue to experience the death of our normal everyday life because of our sheltering in place, I want to encourage you to look around because you will see signs of resurrection, transformation, and new life. This Good Friday, April 10th, 2020, might not feel like a Good Friday, but it really is good. It's good because God is still God and we're still God's people. It's good because the cross reveals to us God's character, that God is involved in the details of our lives. Yes, this is the day where we stare death in the face. Jesus, the human, died today on a cross. But the cross shows us life, not lifelessness. Hope, not hopelessness. And it's a life of God's kingdom of heaven, God's will being done on earth as it's being done in heaven. And this is a Good Friday because we are still connected as friends and family and as a church in the midst of death's sting. We are connected by love. So take some time today on this Good Friday to grieve, cry, get angry, bargain with God, deny that death happens or hurts, and then accept the reality of death as part of our human experience. Be okay with it, because we know that death doesn't have the final word. We know that Easter is coming, and this is where we are headed this Sunday. We're going to the tomb with heavy hearts, but we will not leave the same. We will be different because of the empty tomb. But let us travel together now to the tomb with heavy hearts, but with God's promises all around us of resurrection, transformation, and new life. Amen.